Hello everyone and welcome back to another, I guess this is a vlog video. Going to be talking about movie soundtracks today. I just kind of had this thought about these movie soundtracks, so I just wanted to have like a quick little discussion about them and what's changed with them and so on. So to give you some context, I was at Goodwill and picked up these two albums just a few days ago. So we got Sweet Dreams by LaBouche. We got Seal by Seal. I don't know if this is technically called Seal 2 or something like that, but it's Seal. Both of these albums are really good. And both of these albums have songs on them that you may have not heard off of these albums originally in this format. You may have heard them in movie soundtracks. So if you look at the track list on the Seal album here, this is from 1994. You can look at track 6 if it wants to focus. You have Kiss from a Rose. So originally off of this album, and then on the LaBouche album, let me see, let's flip this around. Track 1 right there is, if it wants to actually show it, may not focus, but it's Be My Lover. I first heard that song on MTV. But these two albums have songs that are featured on very good movie soundtracks, like probably some of the best movie soundtracks, at least from the 90s that I can think of. So Kiss from a Rose, most people are going to know that from Batman Forever. And other people may know Be My Lover from the Night at the Roxbury soundtrack. And I was just kind of got to thinking, like I picked these up because I was like kind of like just saw these and these are really good albums, so I picked them up. And I was thinking that, you don't really see amazing movie soundtracks anymore. I'm not talking about like movie scores, like those are still pretty good, but just movie soundtracks where it just had a lot of really good music on it that you would see in a lot of people's collections, just because the collections of music on these soundtracks, at least in the 90s and probably into the 80s, and it's obviously less so now, where you just had a great collection of music off those, and you don't really see soundtracks like that anymore outside of maybe like the Guardians of the Galaxy films. Like James Gunn has done 3 of those movies and they all have really good soundtracks. The other one that I would say that still makes really good movies with really good soundtracks is Quentin Tarantino. And I feel like those two, James Gunn and Tarantino, are probably the exception to the rule now, that there just are no longer any real good movie soundtracks. One other thing that kind of brought this up was back in February for Black History Month at a local theater. They were playing basically Black History films, but the twist was these are all, I believe, at least all the ones that I went to that I saw New Jack City and Belly there, were those are from the 90s, but the theme was Black History movies with really good soundtracks. So New Jack City's got a really good soundtrack. Belly's got a really good soundtrack as well. I don't remember what other movies they played during that series, but I saw those two movies. And before the movie started, they had like basically like music videos playing from the year that movie was released. So there was like a few music videos from 1991 for the New Jack City movie, and then some other music videos from 1998 for Belly. But I don't know really what has changed. I'm assuming, I think probably streaming, the music industry has probably shifted in such a way where a lot of the stuff that was put together in the 90s was kind of just to, hey, this band wants to be on the soundtrack, put them on a soundtrack so it'll then kind of like increase discoverability maybe. So a lot of bands would probably put either brand new songs on movie soundtrack albums, or they would use stuff that was already pre-existing. Like these two albums here were already pre-existing before their like a movie used their those songs. Some artists would record stuff specifically for movies, and then there were some soundtracks in the 90s that it featured songs from the movie as well as songs that were inspired by the movie, like basically like written directly for it. And that was really cool as well, because it just led to a bunch of really great soundtracks. So I'm thinking the music industry probably, I mean, this is the internet really wasn't what it is today back then. So there wasn't streaming, and then or streaming or anything like that. You couldn't just go on and watch it on YouTube or anything like that. So it just feels like it was a way to potentially increase interest in an artist by having them be on a soundtrack. So, like I guarantee you, I think a lot of probably people probably took interest in Seal after listening to "Kiss from a Rose" off of the Batman Forever soundtrack, for example. Or maybe people took interest in Aerosmith after listening to the Armageddon soundtrack. Um, but it was just kind of like almost like a shower thought. Like, what happened to the amazing movie soundtracks that we used to get? We don't seem to get those anymore. Outside of like a couple directors, maybe. Don't know if there's anybody else really doing that. And I guess movies set in a certain time period probably really kind of count, but don't count. I remember seeing The Nice Guys, I think it was The Nice Guys, in 2016, and it had a really good soundtrack, but it was all kind of period specific to the time period that that movie was set in. So you don't really just see like the big collections of music anymore, especially stuff where it was, like stuff written directly for the movie. But just the thing I kind of miss is these great movie soundtracks. We're going to switch over now and just take a look at some amazing movie soundtracks from the 90s. I'm going to kind of just discuss those shortly, and we'll be right back with that part of the video. All right, and we are back with the second part of this video where we'll just be discussing some amazing movie soundtracks. These are all from the 90s, but this goes back to the 80s as well, and maybe into the early 2000s. But movie soundtracks these days are definitely lacking, compared to these, and it's just we don't see these kind of soundtracks anymore, unfortunately. First up here we have A Night at the Roxbury. I love this movie. But the soundtrack on this one is amazing as well. You have, you have Hadaway, "What Is Love." I definitely think that song basically owes a lot to this movie. I don't think it would be as popular if it wasn't, in the movie and then on this soundtrack as well. You have like Ace of Bases on this. Just an amazing collection of dance songs, like we mentioned earlier. "Be My Lover" by LaBouche is on this album as well, and a lot of people maybe wouldn't even have heard that song if it wasn't for potentially for this soundtrack. So that's Night at the Roxbury. We have Armageddon as well, another 1998 album. Armageddon's a blast. I'm definitely going to be covering it at some point on my 1998 Represent series. But the soundtrack, has Aerosmith, it has Journey, Bon Jovi, and so on. Just a good collection of songs. I Don't Want to Miss a Thing by Aerosmith was kind of like all over everywhere the summer of 1998. Another really good just soundtrack is Armageddon here. Next up, we have Batman Forever. We talked about that one a little bit earlier. Like "Kiss from a Rose" is on it. You can argue that's probably one of, if not the biggest song or his most popular song. It was on, that album we had talked about earlier, but also I don't think a lot of people would have heard that song if it wasn't on this soundtrack. Just like you have U2 on here, a bunch of other just really amazing songs. Probably one of the best soundtracks of all time. Maybe even one of the situations where the soundtrack is better than the movie. I remember liking Batman Forever when it came out, but liking it less than the two Tim Burton ones that had come out previously. But this one was still a lot of fun. Definitely liked it more than Batman and Robin. But the soundtrack on this is just incredible. One of the best soundtracks ever. I remember like a lot of people. I never actually owned this soundtrack, but I had a lot of friends in high school that did. This seemed to be kind of like one of, at least in my high school, one of the most listened to soundtracks I could think of. So that's Batman Forever. Next up, we have Empire Records. I own it now on vinyl, but I owned it briefly for a second when I was part of Columbia House in like the fall of 1995. So it's a 1995 movie, and I did the thing where you sign up for Columbia House and you get like 8 CDs for like $1. It may have been a penny. I think since it was like it was probably $1, but the deal was you would get those CDs for $1, penny, whatever it was, and then you were basically required to purchase at full price 2 albums. I think this is one of the ones that they sent me to purchase. I ended up sending it back because it was one that I did not order. So I was kind of like, and I at that point I hadn't seen the movie, didn't really know anything about it aside from kind of like the cover of the album here because I remember seeing it in a few different magazines at some point, and I wasn't particularly interested in it, so I sent it back. And then it wasn't until years later when I actually saw the movie, and I was like, oh yeah, I own the soundtrack for that briefly. Never listened to it, so I kind of regretted actually sending it back after I saw the movie and saw how fun it was. But then eventually I picked it up on vinyl like 10 or so years ago. But amazing soundtrack, and this movie just captures kind of the '90s or the vibe of record stores in the mid '90s. Kind of miss record stores, going to record stores like that. There's still a few like specialty shops that are like that, but I would always go to like Sam Goody. That was where I would get most of my CDs. Sam Goody, of course, is gone as well, but Empire Records. It's a really fun movie, and the soundtrack is amazing as well. Definitely worth checking out. Next up here, we have Last Action Hero, another situation where the soundtrack could be, depending on who you ask, is maybe better than the movie. Remember, this movie came out in 1993. It kind of didn't do very well. Like critics didn't really like it, and then I think it was kind of not very good commercially. I mean, it came out the same summer as Jurassic Park, so there was definitely some stiff competition. But you have like AC/DC on here, Alice in Chains, Megadeth, Aerosmith, and so on. Just a really good collection of music. And then also, I think the movie actually, on rewatch, actually holds up a lot better than people might remember it holding up. So, Last Action Hero soundtrack, really good. One of the times where the soundtrack album might be better than the movie. But next album up here, we have Pulp Fiction. We talked about that one a little bit earlier, and how Quentin Tarantino just has a tendency to, on top of making really good movies, have really good soundtracks for his movies as well. I remember renting on VHS this movie when it first came out in like the fall of 1995, like rented it on like a Friday afternoon, and then watched it a couple times over that weekend. We of course returned the video, and then went to school, took the bus after school on Monday to Sam Goody, picked the soundtrack up, and it's one of my favorite soundtracks. It still holds up really well. It's got a lot of a good collection of songs. I also like that there's like dialogue bits in there from the movie. Like I said, Tarantino is one of the ones that is still making really good soundtracks and choosing really good songs for his movies. But a Pulp Fiction soundtrack, one of the best. Let's move into our next one here. We have Romeo and Juliet now. This came out in 1996, I believe. And most people, there's going to be a song on this by Garbage, which was Number One Crush, which a lot of people probably wouldn't have even known about if it wasn't for this soundtrack. And this kind of goes back to a point I made earlier in the video about how there's maybe a song you want to promote, or an artist you want to promote, band, or whatever it is. And a way to do that back then was to get them onto a movie soundtrack, either with a new song or something that was already existing. Number One Crush already existed at the time. I believe it was a B-side off of one of their singles from their first album. I don't recall exactly what the single was that this was a B-side for. But without this album, a lot of people may have not even heard of that song because you may have not purchased that single. So if you didn't buy that single, that album, that tape, that single, I think they called them, the cassette or CD, you may have completely missed out on this song if it wasn't for this soundtrack. So that's definitely a great thing about some of these soundtracks is there's music that you may have completely missed out on had that song not been on the soundtrack. Maybe there's an artist or a band that you really like, or you heard a song off of a movie soundtrack from them before hearing anything else, and then it kind of turned you into a fan. So that's one really cool way to like promote artists back then, was to get them onto a movie soundtrack. So again, don't think a lot of people would have even heard that song if it wasn't for this soundtrack. So that's Romeo and Juliet. Next one here we have is Speed. So I picked this up in 1995. I didn't see the movie when it came out in theaters in 1994, but I remember we taped it off of HBO, watched it on HBO, and then my friend came over, I think that same weekend, because I watched it on HBO, and then him and I watched the um, the copy that we had recorded off TV, and we both really liked it. And then same thing with Pulp Fiction, like day after or the Monday after went to school, took after school took the bus to the Sam Goody, picked the soundtrack up. It's got a lot of great music on it. The title track of the movie, and there's a song on the album called "Speed" by Billy Idol, which is really good. There's a good, I think it's a cover of "Rescue Me," and it's done by Pat Benatar. So, and this is one where there was um, songs in the movie that weren't necessarily in the movie, but they were inspired by the movie. So just like a cool thing that people did back in the 90s was to just like record new music for these soundtracks. So that is Speed. Next up we have The Crow. I think The Crow came out in I don't remember if it was 1993 or 1994. I don't recall what year it was. I remember seeing it in 1994, so it may have like came out earlier that year because I remember seeing it like toward the end of that year. Because I remember, I think Rapid Fire came out in like 1992, and then I think it was sometime in 1993 when the shooting happened on the set. And I remember this came out, and I thought the movie was just okay. Like it's not one of my favorite movies, but the soundtrack is awesome. It's one where the soundtrack again is potentially better than the film. So that's the Crow. Next up here we have Wayne's World. And I'm just going to say this, I probably wouldn't even know who Queen was as a band, or I guess is as a band, without this movie. So it came out in 1992. We saw this in the theaters, I think it was like March or April of that year. And the iconic Bohemian Rhapsody scene kind of featured earlier in the film. A lot of people, like probably like my age, potentially younger, probably didn't even know who Queen was until they saw that scene and potentially listened to this soundtrack. So I got the soundtrack. Never had it on CD, but I had it on cassette, which I think I got for Christmas in 1992. And I still have the cassette around somewhere. And I still have a cassette player. I'm looking at it right now. It's kind of busted, but it's not in. You got to like tape the door shut and whatnot. It's kind of definitely seen better days, but. This soundtrack also has a lot of other really good stuff on there. There's like Alice Cooper's on this. But the big takeaway from this soundtrack for me is it was my introduction to Queen, and I love Queen. So kind of owe it to this movie and this soundtrack for that. And that's going to do it for this part of the video. Just kind of showcasing some great movie soundtracks from the 90s. Kind of wish the movie studios and record companies would make movies like this again, or make soundtracks specifically that really are just amazing. We don't really see that nowadays, unfortunately, with the exception, like I mentioned earlier, of James Gunn and Quentin Tarantino. Like especially with James Gunn's Guardians of the Galaxy soundtracks. I haven't picked up the new one yet for Guardians 3. I think I liked the first two more. Guardians 3 has some really good stuff on it too, but I don't think it's as good as the first two. And then really looking forward to whenever Quentin Tarantino releases his new movie. I think it's supposed to be set sometime in the 70s, so hopefully that soundtrack will be great as well. But I just kind of miss these amazing soundtracks. But that's going to do it for this video. Remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. We'll see you again next time. Thanks again for watching. Take care and have a good one.